Two brothers, same blood, same house, same terrible father, raised in the same cold Westerlands keep, and by the time this story picks them up, both of them are professional killers in the direct employ of a monstrous royal family. On the sheer resume of violence, there's an argument that the younger one has done worse in front of the camera than the older one, at least early on. He chases down and murders an unarmed butcher's boy on a king's orders within the first 2 episodes, a killing so casually cruel it gets its own devastated reaction shot from a grieving father. And yet, ask any room full of viewers to name their favorite character in this entire saga, and the younger Clegane brother places near the top of nearly every list ever assembled, beloved, quoted, mourned. Ask that same room about the older brother, and you get silence, or a shudder, or the word monster, and nothing else. Because there is nothing else to say. Same blood, wildly different verdicts. And I don't think that gap is an accident of who did what. I think it's an accident, or rather a deliberate construction, of how each man was introduced to us in the first scenes we ever spent with them, and how the story has treated their inner lives ever since. That's the thesis I want to build out today. Not a ranking of cruelty, but a study of narrative technology. Two brothers, one storytelling apparatus that hands one of them a voice, an origin, a soul the audience is invited into, and the other apparatus that hands the other man nothing at all forever on purpose. I'll pull from the show and the books both, because the two versions actually agree on almost everything here, which tells you the choice is load-bearing rather than incidental to either medium, the usual honesty clause. This is an argument about narrative design, not a moral defense of anyone. The younger brother does genuinely terrible things across this story, and I'm not asking you to forget any of them. Where the books and the show diverge in emphasis, I'll flag it. The pattern is what I want you to see. Here's the metaphor I want you to carry through the whole essay, because I think it's exactly right. Think of a courtroom. Two defendants, same charge sheet, and the entire trial turns on one procedural fact. The defense gets to call one of them to testify. He gets to sit in the chair, tell his story, explain the wound underneath the crime. The other defendant never takes the stand. Not once, not in 70 episodes, not across thousands of pages. The jury, which is us, doesn't acquit the silent one because we believe he's innocent. We convict him more completely, precisely because we were never given a single reason not to. Withholding testimony is itself a verdict. Keep that courtroom in your head, because everything that follows is that procedural asymmetry playing out scene by scene. So, the opening statements. Let's look at how each brother actually enters the story, because the show is almost surgical about staging these two introductions back to back within the same handful of episodes, as if it wants you to compare them directly. The younger brother, the Hound, enters first, and he enters exactly the way you'd expect a hired monster to enter, silent, looming, standing at the shoulder of a cruel princeling, a bodyguard with a burned face who says almost nothing. And his first real action in the story is about as bad as an introduction gets. When the king's son is humiliated and lightly wounded by a girl and her direwolf, the Hound is dispatched to find the boy blamed for it, a butcher's apprentice named Micah who did nothing but run, and he hunts him down on horseback and cuts him nearly in half, then rides back to court and drops the truth of it without a flicker of remorse. It is by any reasonable measure an atrocity committed against a child for the crime of proximity to a tantrum. If the story stopped there, you'd have exactly what I described a moment ago, a resume that's arguably worse than his brother's earliest scenes. This is Breadcrumb 1, and it exists specifically so the show can spend the rest of the season complicating it, because Breadcrumb 2 arrives almost immediately after, and it's the hinge the entire character turns on. Sandor Clegane sits with Sansa Stark, a girl he has no real reason to be kind to, and when she asks about his burns, he tells her. Unprompted, almost bored, no self-pity in his voice at all, which is exactly what makes it devastating. As a boy, he touched one of his older brother's toys, and his brother, for that offense alone, took Sandor's head and held his face down into a burning brazier until the skin melted off the bone, and their father lied to the world afterward and called it a betting accident. That's the entire origin. Delivered flat, like a man reciting an old weather report about a hurricane that happened to level his life. And notice the surgical placement. The story gave you the atrocity first. Cold, unexplained, maximally damning, and only after you'd already judged him does it hand you the file that recontextualizes everything. You don't get to unknow the killing of Mika, but you now know the machine that built the killer, and the machine has a name, and the name is standing right next to him at court every single day. The books do this too, and if anything, they linger on it longer because Sansa's point of view chapters give us pages of Sandor's bitterness rather than a single scene of it. He tells her the same story of the brazier, but the novels let him go further into a raw contempt for the whole apparatus of chivalry itself. Knights, he tells her, are men who've learned to kill and then dress the killing up in silk and title and song, and he'd rather be an honest dog than a lying knight, because a dog doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is. That speech doesn't exist in quite that form in the show, but it's the thesis of the character in either version. He is not less violent than the knighted men around him. He is just the only one refusing to lie about it, and the books make that refusal, that clear-eyed contempt for hypocrisy, into something the reader can actually respect, even while flinching from the man delivering it. Now, Breadcrumb 3, and this is where the story does something remarkable, it gives Sandor a moment of restraint, and it stages that moment directly against his brother in the same sequence, so the comparison is impossible to miss. At a royal tournament, Gregor the Mountain is unhorsed in the joust by a much smaller, cleverer opponent who tricked his warhorse with a mare in heat, and Gregor's response to losing a game is to draw his sword and, in a blind fury, decapitate his own horse on the spot and then turn that sword on the man who beat him, fully intending to commit murder in front of the entire court over a bruised ego at a sporting event. And who stops him? Sandor, his own brother, stepping between Gregor and his target, absorbing the risk of his brother's rage to prevent a killing that would have happened for absolutely no reason at all. In one scene, the show hands you the complete measurement of the gap between these two men. Both are terrifyingly violent. Only one of them has a threshold, a point past which he intervenes even against his own blood. The other has no threshold visible anywhere in the text. And that's Breadcrumb 4, the one that matters most, because it isn't really a breadcrumb so much as an absence. Watch how Gregor Clegane is introduced, and watch what never happens to him afterward. He does not get a Sansa scene. He does not get a brazier story of his own, an origin the narrative asks you to sit with. In the show, across the entirety of his run, he speaks perhaps a few dozen words, most of them commands or grunts. He exists almost entirely through effect, bodies, rumor, reputation, the horror registering on other characters' faces when his name comes up. The books are, if anything, even more deliberate about this. Long before we ever see Gregor do anything on the page, Ned Stark's own chapters carry the reputation ahead of the man. Whispers that he may have killed his own father in a hunting accident engineered to look accidental. Whispers that he killed his sister for some private offense. And, most damning of all, the widely believed, quietly acknowledged truth that during the war that put Robert on the throne, it was Gregor's hands that murdered Rhaegar Targaryen's wife and butchered her small children, a war crime so total that even the men who benefited from it flinch to discuss its details. That's how the books hand you Gregor, not through his own testimony ever, but through a slow accumulation of secondhand horror, delivered by everyone except him. He is a rumor with a body attached. By the time you actually watch him fight, you're not meeting a character. You're confirming a reputation. Compare the information architecture directly, because this is the whole essay in miniature. Sandor's worst act, the killing of Mika, is shown to us directly in the moment, and then explained afterward by the man himself, in his own voice, unprompted, which is a kind of accountability even if it isn't remorse. Gregor's worst acts are never shown to us in real time at all in the early story. They arrive pre-digested as reputation, folklore, the horrified testimony of everyone but him, and he is never once given the scene where he explains himself, because the story has already decided and wants you to decide that there is no explanation available that would be worth hearing. One brother gets cross-examined, the other is convicted in absentia and simply produced, later, to enact the sentence everyone already assumed was coming. Let me take the tangent this essay needs, because there's a scene later in the story that proves this pattern was never really about the sheer act, and everything about the access, and it's the trial by combat where Gregor faces the Dornish prince Oberyn Martell. This is arguably the single most brutal death the show ever staged, an actual skull crushed on screen in explicit, unbearable detail, and it happens because Oberyn, fighting to avenge his murdered sister, gets overconfident and lets his guard down at the moment of victory. It is, by pure spectacle, worse than almost anything Sandor ever does in the entire run. And yet audiences don't walk away from that scene reassessing Sandor's earlier crimes upward, or suddenly finding Gregor sympathetic through sheer scale of horror. If anything, the opposite happens, because the scene changes nothing about the information asymmetry that was set years earlier. Gregor still says almost nothing before he does it. We still get no interior access, no origin, no scene where the story pauses to ask why. And shortly after, the show pushes the withholding to its logical, almost darkly funny extreme. Gregor dies from the poison on Oberon's spear, and is resurrected by the Crown's alchemists into a hulking, silent, reanimated thing that eventually isn't even permitted its own name for a stretch, referred to instead by a borrowed title, Sir Robert Strong. The story that never gave this man a voice literally takes away the one thing he still had left, his name, and replaces him with a walking weapon. It is the single most honest piece of symbolism in the entire series about how this character was always being treated. He wasn't a person losing his humanity. He was a story that never granted him any, formalizing the arrangement. Meanwhile, watch what continues to happen to Sandor across the exact same years, because the show keeps making deposits into the account it opened with the Brazier story. During the riot at King's Landing, with the city dissolving into a starving mob, it's Sandor who fights through the chaos to drag Sansa to safety, at real risk to self for a girl he owes nothing. During the battle that follows, terrified for what is, we later learn, the first time in the audience's memory, of open flame, given his own history with fire, he abandons his post and deserts the Kingsguard, but not before he offers to take Sansa with him, out of the city, away from the people who use her, and when she refuses, he leaves his white cloak behind on her floor rather than simply vanishing, a small, wordless gesture that reads as the closest thing this bitter man has to an apology. The books preserve this beat almost exactly, cloak and all. And later, on the road with Arya, we get pages and seasons of him functioning as an unlikely, foul-mouthed protector, teaching a traumatized child to survive a war he despises, admitting in his own words that he's never once been able to hurt someone smaller and weaker than him, which is precisely the crime his brother commits, without a second thought, against his own family, at the toy box, at the very start of both their lives. Every single one of these scenes is another deposit into the same account the Brazier story opened, proof, delivered again and again in the man's own voice and his own choices, that whatever he is, he did not choose the entirety of it, and that some fixed point of decency survived what was done to him. So here's the real kicker, the place where the courtroom metaphor pays off completely, when these two brothers finally meet again at the very end of the story, fighting each other inside a collapsing, burning castle while the whole city dies around them. The show gives Sandor one last piece of testimony, and it gives Gregor, true to every single scene that came before, absolutely nothing. Sandor looks at what his brother has become, this silent, reanimated, unkillable thing wearing a stolen title, and he tells him, essentially, that he's always known this moment was coming, that some fear can only be ended by walking directly into the fire that made you. And then he does exactly that, dragging both of them off the tower into the flames, choosing his own death specifically to guarantee his brother doesn't survive either. It is a final act of will, spoken, explained, chosen, by a man who has been given voice after voice after voice across the entire run to justify exactly why he needed to make it. Gregor, meanwhile, says nothing in that scene, because he has never said anything, because the story closed his testimony before it ever opened, back at Ned Stark's dinner table, in a rumor about a hunting accident and a sister and a Dornish princess's children. He dies exactly as he lived on the page and on the screen, as a verdict, not a witness. Let me offer 3 readings of what this all means, and as always, I think they stack rather than compete. The first reading is the simplest. This is a story about the transformative power of interiority. Give an audience access to a person's wound, even a monstrous person's wound, and they will extend a kind of grace that pure violence alone never earns. Sandor is proof that sympathy in fiction isn't rationed according to body count. It's rationed according to access. Gregor, denied access from his very first mention, was simply never eligible for the grace his brother kept earning, no matter how the two of them might have compared on a ledger of raw harm. The second reading is more uncomfortable, and it's the one the books push harder than the show. This asymmetry might not be entirely fair, and the story seems to know it. Sandor gets to narrate his own trauma and have it received as mitigation. Gregor's trauma, whatever it was, growing up under the same father in the same house, is never even investigated, not by the story and not by a single character in it. Everyone simply assumes there's nothing there worth finding, and moves straight to disposing of him. The younger brother is granted a soul because someone bothered to ask. The older brother is denied one, in part because nobody ever did. That's not necessarily an injustice built into the world. It might be an injustice built into how stories and audiences decide whose pain is worth the runtime. And the third reading is the one I keep landing on, the fault line with the shadow. The two brothers were never really a study in different levels of cruelty at all. They're a study in what a story chooses to explain and what it chooses to simply present as fact. One Clegane brother was handed a brazier scene, a cloak on a floor, a girl he protected, a boy he refused to hurt, and a final chosen death with a sentence attached to it. The other was handed a reputation, a silence, a stolen name, and a skull crushed on camera with nothing said before or after. Same blood, same father, same terrible house. And an entire fandom's worth of love pointed at exactly one of them, not because the story proved he deserved it more, but because the story is the only one of the two of them that ever took the stand. That's the trail. Two brothers, one voice given, one voice withheld, and a jury of millions who convicted the silent one the moment they realized nobody was ever going to ask him to speak. Take care of yourselves out there.